Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. On the morning of July 11th, 2015, the most secure prison in Mexico ran its head count and came up one man short. In the corner of cell number 20, behind the lip of the shower, was a hole in the concrete floor. It dropped into a tunnel nearly a mile long, wired with lights, fitted with ventilation and a small rail track that carried a modified motorcycle, and the man who had vanished through it was the most wanted drug trafficker on Earth. He was born Joaquin Archivaldo Guzman Loera on April 4, 1957, in the mountain hamlet of La Tuna in Sinaloa. The family was poor, the eldest of 7, and his formal schooling stopped somewhere around the 3rd grade. He stood about 5'6", which is where the nickname came from. El Chapo, Shorty. He learned the trade under the old Guadalajara organization, run by Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, and when that empire fractured in the late 1980s, Guzman built his own from the pieces. They called it the Sinaloa Cartel. The Justice Department would later describe it as one of the most prolific, violent, and dominant cartels the world had ever seen. At its height, it controlled somewhere between 40 and 60% of the drugs moving through Mexico, with annual earnings estimated near $3 billion. What set Guzman apart was not the volume. It was the ingenuity. He engineered cross-border tunnels with lighting and rail systems. He packed cocaine into cans of jalapenos, one shipment alone topping 7 tons, and hid more inside fire extinguishers. He moved product by submarine, by carbon fiber aircraft built to dodge radar, and by freight trains with secret compartments. He even paid an engineer $1 million to build him a private encrypted phone network he alone controlled. The violence was constant and personal. A 1992 shootout against the rival Tijuana faction at a Puerto Vallarta nightclub left 6 people dead. Witnesses at his trial testified that he ordered torture and killings, and in one interview, he claimed responsibility for somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 deaths. He was first captured in 1993 and sentenced to 20 years. On January 19, 2001, he rolled out of Puente Grande prison hidden in a laundry cart, an escape that reportedly cost around $2.5 million in bribes. He spent the next 13 years as a fugitive, running the organization from the Sinaloa Mountains while it spread into dozens of countries, and his name began appearing on lists of the world's wealthiest people. He was recaptured in February of 2014, then disappeared again through that engineered tunnel in 2015. Investigators later marveled that his diggers had used satellite navigation to bore with precision to a spot directly beneath his shower. The final capture came on January 8, 2016, after a shootout in the coastal city of Los Mochis. By January of 2017, he was on a plane to the United States, and there would be no tunnel waiting. The trial in Brooklyn was overwhelming. 14 cooperating witnesses took the stand. Prosecutors entered seizures totaling more than 130,000 kilograms of narcotics, a gold-plated rifle, and pistols set with diamonds and engraved with his initials. On February 12, 2019, Judge Brian Cogan presided as the jury convicted him on all 10 counts, including running a continuing criminal enterprise. At sentencing that July, Guzman told the court there had been no justice for him at all. The prosecutor answered that there had been countless victims of his orders to kill and that he had shown no remorse for any of them. The lead federal prosecutor called it a sentence with no escape and no return. His own defense attorney remarked bitterly that the government could bury Guzman under tons of steel in Colorado, but it would never wash away the stink of how the case had been run. He received life, plus 30 years, and a forfeiture order of $12.6 billion. Today he sits in solitary confinement at a supermax facility in Colorado, in a cell with no floor to dig through. But Guzman was not the first to turn cocaine into an empire built on bodies. Decades before him, the blueprint had already been written, and it belonged to a woman the underworld of Medellin learned to fear. Griselda Blanco. Long before the cartels became household names, the most dangerous figure in the Miami cocaine wars was a grandmother from Colombia who liked to be called the Godmother. She is suspected of involvement in around 40 murders, including all 3 of her husbands, which earned her a second name, the Black Widow, and the killing method she is credited with inventing would, decades later, be used to end her own life. She was born on February 15, 1943. Sources disagree on whether it was Cartagena or Santa Marta, but she moved to Medellin as a small child, and the stories from those years, most of them impossible to verify, describe someone already capable of violence. By adulthood, she had reportedly worked as a pickpocket on the streets before marrying a trafficker named Alberto Bravo, who pulled her into cocaine. She built her first operation in New York in the early 1970s, then relocated to Miami, where the real money was, and where they came to call her La Madrina. At her peak, she is believed to have smuggled more than 3 tons of cocaine into the country, netting as much as $80 million a month, and she supplied markets across New York, Miami, and Los Angeles. Her innovations were grim and practical. She designed lingerie and girdles with hidden compartments, so female couriers could carry product through customs unnoticed. She recruited young men as smugglers and muscle, and she is widely credited with originating the motorcycle assassination, a gunman riding up alongside a target stuck in traffic and vanishing before anyone understood what had happened. She became a central figure in the late 1970s and early 80s bloodshed that journalists nicknamed the Cocaine Cowboys, a stretch of violence often traced to the shootout at the Dadeland Mall on July 11, 1979. The brazenness was the point. Killings happened in daylight, in shopping centers, and on open streets, and for nearly a decade she ran her network from the shadows of 2 countries, indicted in New York, yet effectively untouchable in Colombia. The cruelty had no floor. In 1982, one of her hits went wrong when her gunmen missed their adult target, and a 2-year-old child was killed instead. According to her own hitman's later testimony, when she was told what had happened, she said she was glad. Put plainly, a small child died because the men she sent to kill someone else were careless, and the woman who gave the order felt nothing. Estimates of her total body count run from around 40 all the way up to 200, though in the end, she was convicted of only 3 killings. Justice came slowly and clumsily. She was first indicted in New York in April of 1975, as part of a sweep that swept up roughly 30 people, and she fled back to Colombia before agents could reach her. They finally arrested her in Irvine, California, on February 17, 1985, and she was convicted that year, drawing 15 years. A separate Miami murder case that could have ended in a death sentence collapsed for an almost absurd reason. The star witness, her former hitman, was caught having phone sex with secretaries inside the prosecutor's own office, and the case fell apart. She pleaded guilty to reduced charges in 1998 and was deported in 2004. On September 3, 2012, at 69 years old, she was shot outside a Medellin butcher shop by an assassin on a motorcycle. The method she helped invent had circled all the way back to her. One filmmaker who chronicled the era called it a textbook case of living by the sword and dying by the sword. Her only surviving son later said he had to become a different person entirely, so his own children would never live the life he had lived. Blanco moved her product through hidden seams and human couriers, but one of her countrymen had a far more audacious idea. Why move a few kilos at a time when you could simply buy an island and fly the cocaine in by the ton? Carlos later. In the 1970s, the smart money and smuggling meant suitcases and speedboats, a few kilos at a time. Carlos later thought bigger. He bought an entire island in the Bahamas, barely 200 miles off the Florida coast, and from a private airstrip there he is believed to have funneled as much as 80% of the cocaine reaching the United States, earning as much as $300 million a year. And the way it all came apart is the strangest part of the story. He was born on September 7, 1949, in Armenia, Colombia, to a German immigrant father who worked as an engineer and a Colombian mother, which made him a dual citizen. He started small, with stolen cars and marijuana, and a stretch in a Connecticut prison in 1974 put him in a cell beside an American smuggler named George Jung, who taught him how the cocaine trade actually moved. Later went home with an education and a plan. He became a co-founder of the Medellin cartel, and his contribution was logistics on a scale nobody had attempted. He bought Norman's Cay for around $900,000, pushed out the residents, and from roughly 1978 to 1982 turned the island into an airborne transfer hub. Small planes came and went around the clock. Armed men kept outsiders away from the strip. Attack dogs roamed the grounds, and bribes reportedly climbed all the way to the office of the Bahamian Prime Minister. He was also a genuine eccentric, an open admirer of John Lennon, and far more disturbingly, of Adolf Hitler. He founded a fascist political movement back home built around opposing the treaty that would let Colombia extradite its traffickers to the United States. You sometimes hear his personal fortune put as high as $2.7 billion, though that figure is almost certainly inflated. None of it saved him. He was captured near the town of Guarne on February 4, 1987. And to this day, some believe Pablo Escobar himself fed the police his location to remove a rival. There was no drawn-out fight in Colombia. He was put on a plane almost immediately, the first major Colombian trafficker ever sent north, and tried in Jacksonville, Florida. His swift extradition sent a shock through the Medellin cartel, proof that the treaty they so feared could actually reach them. In May of 1988, a jury convicted him on every count, and he was sentenced to life plus 135 years. The United States Attorney General at the time called it one of the biggest victories of the entire drug war. Then later made a deal. In 1991, he testified against Panama's former leader Manuel Noriega, and in exchange, his sentence was cut to 55 years. Here is where it gets remarkable. Later was quietly released from American prison in 2020 after roughly 33 years and deported to Germany, where he was recovering from cancer. In 2025, he briefly returned to Colombia, was arrested on March 28th, and was freed again 3 days later on March 31st, after a judge ruled that an old Colombian weapons conviction had passed its statute of limitations. He is alive, he is free, and he is living in Germany. That's not a typo, by the way. He once reflected that plenty of people fantasize about owning a private island, and he had actually lived that fantasy, except he had done the whole thing illegally, and said he wanted others to learn from him rather than follow him. Later built his fortune in the air. But while he was flying cocaine over the Caribbean, a different kind of trafficker was rising on the ground in Mexico, a man whose rage against a single American agent would set off the largest homicide investigation the DEA had ever launched. Rafael Caro Quintero. In February of 1985, a young American agent in Guadalajara walked out of the United States consulate and vanished. He had spent months feeding the intelligence that led to the destruction of a marijuana plantation nearly the size of a small town. The man who owned that plantation wanted him to pay for it, and what he ordered done would keep him on the run for almost 40 years. Rafael Caro Quintero was born on October 24, 1952, in the hill country of Badiraguato, Sinaloa. In the 1970s, he co-founded the Guadalajara cartel alongside Felix Gallardo and Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, the organization that served as the bridge between Colombian cocaine and the smuggling corridors of Mexico. He moved enormous quantities of marijuana into the United States, and at home he played the benefactor, reportedly financing a highway and bringing electricity to villages. The organization he helped run was pulling in something close to $5 billion a year, and his pride was Rancho Búfalo, a plantation in the state of Chihuahua sprawling across roughly 2,500 acres. That plantation was its undoing. A DEA agent named Enrique Camarena, known to everyone as Kiki, gathered the intelligence that led to its destruction in 1984, wiping out a fortune in product overnight. Caro Quintero wanted revenge. On February 7, 1985, corrupt state police officers seized Camarena right outside the consulate and handed him over. You would think someone inside that police force would have said something. Nobody did. He was taken to a private property, and what the investigation later uncovered was staggering. He had been interrogated over roughly 30 hours, the sessions recorded on tape, and his captors injected him with stimulants to keep him conscious through it. On the recordings, he could be heard asking only that his injured ribs be bandaged. He died on February 9th. The bodies of Camarena and his pilot were not found until weeks later, on March 5, 1985. The case triggered Operation Leyenda, the biggest homicide investigation the agency had ever mounted. The killing of an American agent on foreign soil changed everything, hardening the way the United States dealt with the cartels for a generation. Caro Quintero fled to Costa Rica and was arrested there in April of 1985, then sentenced in Mexico to 40 years. But in August of 2013, a Mexican court released him on a technicality, and he disappeared back into the mountains. The decision enraged Washington and strained relations between the two governments for years. The outrage was immediate. The FBI placed him on its 10 most wanted list in April of 2018 with a $20 million reward, and a senior DEA official vowed that no matter how long it took or where he hid, the agency would stay patient and committed. He was finally recaptured on July 15, 2022. On February 27, 2025, he was sent to the United States as one of 29 cartel figures expelled together in a single transfer and arraigned in a Brooklyn courtroom, where he pleaded not guilty. By some accounts, the handcuffs locked onto his wrists had once belonged to Camarena himself. A federal prosecutor described him as a man who used extreme violence to protect the cartel and beat or killed anyone who got in his way. A White House spokesperson called him one of the most evil cartel bosses in the world. The agency Camarena died serving marked the moment with 2 words: justice served. As of 2026, he sits in federal custody awaiting trial, and prosecutors may seek the death penalty. Caro Quintero built his empire on Mexican soil and Colombian supply. But all that cocaine had to land somewhere, and in the 1980s, nobody pushed more of it through the streets of Los Angeles than a high school athlete who had never learned to read. Freeway Rick Ross. He was a promising tennis player with a real shot at a college scholarship, right up until a coach realized he had reached his senior year of high school unable to read a single word. The scholarship evaporated, so Ricky Donald Ross turned to the only other thing South Central Los Angeles seemed to be offering, and within a few years, prosecutors say, his cocaine operation was grossing more than $1 million a day. He was born on January 26, 1960, in Troop, Texas, and raised in south-central Los Angeles. He had been a standout at Dorsey High until the illiteracy cost him everything, and the nickname Freeway came later, from the strip of properties he owned along the Harbor Freeway. He stepped into the cocaine trade around 1979, and his fortune rested on one connection, a Nicaraguan exile named Oscar Danilo Blandon, who sold him cocaine at prices nobody else could touch. Federal prosecutors later estimated that between 1982 and 1989, Ross bought and resold several metric tons, grossing more than $900 million, with distribution reaching 42 cities. It is worth stressing those are prosecution estimates. He was never actually convicted for that Los Angeles empire itself. What is not in dispute is the damage. The cocaine Ross moved helped fuel the crack epidemic that tore through Los Angeles neighborhoods in the 1980s, a wave of addiction and violence whose wreckage long outlasted his empire. He ran it like a corporation. He connected with both the Bloods and the Crips to handle the street-level distribution, used police scanners and voice scramblers to stay ahead of investigators, and at one point, a county sheriff admitted, with something close to embarrassment, that Ross's men had better equipment than the deputies chasing them. The Los Angeles Times would later describe him as the dealer who boasted his coast-to-coast empire grossed more than $1 million a day. Then came the part of the story that still starts arguments. In 1996, the journalist Gary Webb published a series alleging that Blandon's cocaine profits had helped fund the CIA-backed Contra rebels in Nicaragua. A Justice Department investigation the following year found no evidence the agency had any relationship with Ross or Blandon, though it acknowledged the CIA had kept working with Contra figures who were themselves suspected of trafficking. The direct connection that so many people came to believe in was never substantiated by that investigation. The end came through betrayal. By the mid-1990s, Blandon had quietly become a DEA informant, and on March 2, 1995, he set up his old customer in a reverse sting near San Diego, where Ross agreed to buy more than 100 kilograms of cocaine. He was convicted in 1996 and sentenced to life under the federal three-strikes law, not the California state version that gets reported so often. But a federal appeals court ruled the law had been applied incorrectly, since the prior offenses all stemmed from a single continuous course of conduct. His lawyers fought the life sentence for years before the court agreed it had been a mistake, and he was resentenced to 20 years. He walked free on September 29, 2009, having served around 14 years. Ross rebuilt his life completely in the open. He wrote a memoir, became a motivational speaker, and moved into the legal cannabis business. He even sued the rapper who had taken his name, the performer William Roberts, who records as Rick Ross, and lost when a court sided with the rapper on free speech grounds. And no, I'm not making that up. The man himself likes to point out that he started with $125 and turned it into days where the money came rolling in by the millions. Ross walked out of prison and got to tell his own story. But for every kingpin who lived long enough to do that, there were others who built fortunes so vast that no courtroom ever held them, and at least one whose empire would make even Freeway Rick Ross look like a corner vendor. If you're liking this video and you're not subscribed yet, now's the time. We drop new cases every day. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Pablo Escobar. For 7 years running, Forbes magazine listed a man from Colombia among the wealthiest people alive, with a fortune estimated at $30 billion. He gave money to the poor, built them houses and football pitches, and a corner of Medellin still defends his name to this day. He also ordered a passenger plane blown out of the sky with more than 100 people aboard. And that is only where the horror begins. He was born on December 1, 1949, in Rio Negro, and raised near Medellin, the third of 7 children. His mother was a school teacher, his father a farmer, and as a young man, he drifted through petty crime, reportedly everything from stealing headstones to selling fake diplomas and smuggling contraband cigarettes, before moving into car theft and kidnapping for ransom. Around 1976, he founded what became the Medellin cartel, building supply routes that pulled coca out of Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador, refined it in Colombia, and pushed it north into the United States. The scale is almost impossible to picture. At its peak, the cartel is believed to have controlled more than 80% of the cocaine entering the United States, with reports of 15 tons moving every single day and as much as $420 million flowing in every week. Forbes ranked him among the richest people on Earth for 7 straight years, and in 1989 placed him 7th in the world. He built a 7,000-acre estate called Hacienda Nápoles, complete with its own private zoo, and in 1982 he even won a seat as an alternate member of Colombia's Congress. His rule ran on a simple slogan: Plata o plomo, silver or lead. Take the bribe or take the bullet, and somehow it gets worse. In 1984, he ordered the assassination of Justice Minister Rodrigo Lara Bonilla. In August of 1989, he had the leading presidential candidate, Luis Carlos Galán, gunned down at a rally. Then, on November 27, 1989, in a failed attempt to kill another candidate, his people bombed Avianca Flight 203 in midair, killing all 107 passengers on board and 3 more on the ground. 9 days later, a truck bomb tore apart a government building in Bogotá and killed scores more. The war he waged on the Colombian state was staggering on its own. He put bounties on the heads of police officers, and hundreds were killed collecting them, while bombings and assassinations turned Medellin into one of the deadliest cities on Earth. His chief assassin, a man known as La Kika, was later convicted in an American courtroom and handed 10 consecutive life sentences. By the early 1990s, the walls were closing in. Escobar struck a deal and surrendered in 1991 on the condition he would not be extradited, and he served his time in a luxury prison he had built for himself called La Catedral, a compound with a football pitch, a bar, and sweeping views of the valley, where he kept running the cartel as if nothing had changed. When the government tried to move him to a real facility in July of 1992, he simply walked out. What followed was one of the largest manhunts in history. A special police unit known as the Search Block, backed by American forces and shadowed by a vigilante group calling itself Los Pepes, spent months tracing his phone signals and hunting his associates one by one. On December 2nd, 1993, one day after his 44th birthday, he was cornered on a rooftop in Medellin and shot dead. To this day, it remains disputed whether the fatal shot came from a police rifle or from his own hand. More than 25,000 people flooded the streets for his funeral, reaching into the coffin to touch him. He had once said he would rather have a grave in Colombia than a cell in the United States, and in the end, that is exactly what he got. Escobar produced the cocaine on a scale the world had never seen. But thousands of miles north, an entirely different kind of empire was rising on the back of that same powder. Built not in the jungle, but in the nightclubs of Atlanta, by 2 brothers from Detroit who turned drug money into a record label. Demetrius Big Meech Flannery. They threw parties that rappers still talk about, rolled through Atlanta in fleets of luxury cars, and wore diamond chains spelling out 3 letters. BMF. To the public, the Black Mafia family looked like a flashy hip-hop label run by a charismatic promoter who called himself Big Meech. federal agents saw something very different: a cocaine pipeline moving hundreds of millions of dollars across the country. Demetrius Flannery was born on June 21, 1968, in Detroit, and his younger brother Terry, known as Southwest T, arrived on January 10, 1970. They grew up poor and church-going on the southwest side of the city, and as teenagers in the late 1980s, they started small, selling $50 bags of cocaine on the corner under a crew name, the 50 Boys. From that corner grew BMF, the Black Mafia family. What set them apart was reach. They were never just a local crew. They built a coast-to-coast distribution chain, moving cocaine from the southwest border all the way to the clubs of the east. By the year 2000, the operation had become a nationwide network. Terry ran a hub in Los Angeles, handling shipments coming up from Mexican suppliers, while Demetrius ran distribution out of Atlanta. According to court documents, at its height, the organization had more than 500 members across the United States and moved over $270 million between 1989 and 2005. That's not a typo, by the way. $270 million. And Demetrius did something almost no drug boss had tried before. He launched a record label, BMF Entertainment, signing an artist and rubbing shoulders with some of the biggest names in hip-hop, using the music business as both a public brand and a way to wash the money clean. The lifestyle was the whole point, and it was also the problem. The cars, the jewelry, the parties splashed across magazines. All of it pulled the eyes of law enforcement straight onto them. Demetrius understood publicity better than almost anyone in the game, and he used it to turn BMF into a household name in certain circles. The irony is that the same fame he chased became the exact trail investigators followed. They eventually tapped Terry's phone and pulled roughly 900 pages of transcripts over 5 months. Demetrius, for all his visibility, was never once caught talking business on a wiretap. It did not save him. The federal effort against them, called Operation Motor City Mafia, had been building since October of 2003. In 2005, agents raided the organization, arresting around 30 members and seizing roughly $21 million in cash and jewelry, more than a dozen homes, and 36 vehicles. In November of 2007, both brothers pleaded guilty to running a continuing criminal enterprise that had distributed cocaine for some 15 years, and prosecutors sought a money judgment of $270 million, the full sum they said the organization had earned. The following September, each was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. The lead agent on the case said the Black Mafia family had been a violent and sophisticated operation born right there in Detroit, and that the law had finally caught up, leaving communities across the country safer with the brothers behind bars. In a recorded prison call years later, Demetrius reflected that it had all started with being poor, with welfare and food stamps at the gas station, and that once he and his brother tasted real money, they never wanted that feeling to end. Their story did not end behind bars. Demetrius saw his sentence reduced and was moved to a halfway house in Miami in October of 2024, with his term effectively winding down by early 2026. Terry was granted compassionate release to home confinement in 2020 and walked free in August of 2025. By then, the name BMF had taken on a life of its own, referenced in countless songs, a brand that outlived the empire that created it. The Flannery brothers built their operation in the spotlight, and that spotlight is exactly what brought it down. But the blueprint for that kind of street-level empire had been drawn decades earlier, on the other side of the country, by a man whose funeral would bring an entire city to a standstill: Felix Mitchell. When he was laid to rest in 1986, The procession rolled through East Oakland, behind a glass-walled, horse-drawn carriage and a long line of luxury cars, drawing crowds so large that one local radio personality compared the scene to the day Martin Luther King died. The man inside the bronze coffin was barely 31 years old, and in the strange years that followed his death, the violence on those streets did not fall. It climbed. Felix Mitchell was born on August 23, 1954, in East Oakland, and grew up in the housing projects along 69th Avenue, a place locals called 69 Village. He dropped out of high school and built a crew that took its name from those streets, the 69 Mob. What he created is often described as one of the first large-scale, street gang-controlled drug operations in the country, an organization that came to dominate the heroin trade across the East Bay in the late 1970s and early 80s. Other crews around the nation would later copy the model he built. The money was enormous, though the exact figures were never settled in court. Estimates ran from around $400,000 a week to as much as $1 million a month. He connected with a major Los Angeles supplier known as Tootie Reese and pushed his reach toward Southern California and even out to the Midwest. His real innovation was organizational. He ran a strict hierarchy built around controlled territory, put neighborhood teenagers to work as lookouts and couriers, and used drive-by shootings to punish rivals and anyone who stepped out of line. His main competition came from the organizations run by a man named Mickey Moore and a group known as Funktown, and the fighting between them filled Oakland's streets with bodies for years. His first federal trial ended in a mistrial. The second did not. In 1985, he was convicted of drug conspiracy, running a continuing criminal enterprise, and several counts of tax evasion, and 6 of his associates were convicted alongside him, though they drew lighter terms. The judge who sentenced him to life without parole reportedly described the 69 Mob as the most violent organization she had ever encountered. He was sent to the federal penitentiary at Leavenworth, and on August 21, 1986, 2 days before his 32nd birthday, he was stabbed to death by another inmate. He had been behind bars barely a year. The reported motive was almost unbelievably small, a dispute over a $10 debt. Then came the twist that turned a convicted heroin boss into a folk legend. His funeral was a spectacle of wealth and mourning, with floral arrangements shaped like dollar signs, a procession of gleaming cars, and thousands of onlookers lining the route, the send-off of a king rather than a convicted drug lord. Months later, in January of 1987, a federal appeals court formally vacated his convictions, on the technical ground that he had died before his appeal could be heard. One prosecutor protested that the ruling had made a hero and a martyr out of a heroin dealer, and that it simply was not right. Mitchell's own attorney called it a hollow victory, since Felix was dead either way. But the darkest part of his legacy was what criminologists later named the Felix Mitchell paradox. Put simply, taking him off the streets made things worse, not better. His monopoly had actually suppressed competition and kept smaller gangs in line, and once he was gone, rival crews splintered and went to war, and both the violence and the flow of drugs went up. Researchers still point to his case as a warning about what happens when you decapitate a criminal monopoly with no plan for the vacuum left behind. Mitchell had shown how one man could organize an entire city's drug trade, but far to the south, another man was about to do the same thing to an entire country, and when he was finally arrested, he would simply redraw the map of Mexican crime from inside his cell. Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo. They called him the Godfather, the boss of bosses, the man who took scattered, feuding Mexican smugglers and welded them into a single machine that funneled Colombian cocaine into the United States. But the most lasting thing Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo ever did, he did after he was already in handcuffs. From behind bars, he carved up his empire and handed the pieces to his lieutenants, and those pieces became the cartels still tearing Mexico apart today. He was born on January 8, 1946, on a ranch near Culiacan in Sinaloa. He studied business, then took a job as an agent with the Mexican Federal Judicial Police, even working as a bodyguard for the governor of Sinaloa. For years, those law enforcement ties handed his network a kind of protection most criminals could only dream of, with officials on the payroll looking the other way. Alongside Rafael Caro Quintero and Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, he co-founded the Guadalajara cartel, and he became the crucial link in the chain. The man who connected Colombian cocaine suppliers to the smuggling corridors of Mexico, routing much of the supply through a middleman named Juan Mata Ballesteros that tied his network directly to the Cali cartel. His arrangement was clever and ruthless. Rather than charging the Colombians cash to move their product, his network took a cut of the cocaine itself, around half of every shipment, which meant the more they smuggled, the richer he became. It made him less a smuggler than a tax collector on an entire industry. At its height, the organization was reportedly pulling in something near $5 billion a year and had nearly monopolized trafficking through Mexico. They called him El Padrino, the Godfather, and El Jefe de Jefes, the boss of bosses, and for a long while, the names fit. It was Felix Gallardo who was implicated in ordering the kidnapping of the American agent Enrique Camarena, the crime that brought the full weight of the United States down on the Guadalajara organization. When the agent's torture and death enraged Washington, it was Felix Gallardo's network that paid the price, and eventually him personally. He was arrested in April of 1989 and sentenced to 40 years. But prison did not end his influence. For a time, he reportedly kept running operations from his cell using a mobile phone, and years later, in 2017, a fresh trial added another 37 years to his sentence. His true legacy was the one he engineered on his way down. Facing the end of his freedom, he is credited with summoning the country's top traffickers to a meeting in Acapulco in 1989 and dividing Mexico into territories, handing each region to a different lieutenant. He told them to stop fighting one another and start cooperating. Each man master of his own plaza, and for a brief moment, it actually held. Those territories became the Sinaloa, Tijuana, and Juarez cartels, the very organizations whose wars would kill tens of thousands of people in the decades that followed. One man's prison cell reorganization became the blueprint of modern Mexican crime. Today, he is still alive and still locked up, though barely. A judge granted him house arrest in 2022, citing his age and more than 20 documented illnesses, among them pneumonia, tuberculosis, and diabetes. But the transfer kept getting suspended over legal challenges and problems with his ankle monitor. The back and forth over whether a dying old man should finish his days in a cell or under guard at home has dragged on for years. He is blind in one eye, deaf in one ear, and often relies on an oxygen tank. The Mexican president himself acknowledged that the old man needed treatment prison could not provide, that he took a great deal of medicine, and that his condition was delicate. Felix Gallardo once told an interviewer that his family was already digging a hole under a tree to bury him, and that he had given up all hope of ever walking free. He divided the spoils of his empire among his men, and one of the figures who inherited a piece would go on to build something even larger in the skies above Mexico. He flew cocaine by the plane load, amassed a fortune to rival Escobar's, and then tried to erase his own face. Amado Carrillo Fuentes. By the mid-1990s, he was said to be the second richest drug trafficker on the planet. behind only Pablo Escobar sitting on a fortune estimated at around $25 billion. They called him the Lord of the Skies because he moved cocaine using a fleet of more than 30 old passenger jets, flying it out of Colombia by the planeload. And he did not die in a shootout or a prison cell. He died on an operating table trying to become someone else. Amado Carrillo Fuentes was born on December 17, 1954, in a small Sinaloan town, one of 12 children. His uncle, a senior figure in the Guadalajara organization, brought him into the business and sent him to the border city of Ojinaga to learn the trade under the smugglers who ran it. He was a patient student, absorbing lessons in discretion that would define his entire career. In 1993, he took control of the Juarez cartel the direct way by having his own boss assassinated, and he set about building something the world had not seen before. His genius was logistics in the air. Where others used boats and tunnels and human mules, Carrillo Fuentes bought a fleet of Boeing 727 jetliners and flew cocaine north in bulk, which is how he earned his nickname. It was an operation so large and so airborne that it changed the way investigators thought about smuggling altogether. He took payment from the Colombian suppliers in product rather than cash, partnered with nearly every major player of his era, from the Cali cartel to El Chapo's people to the Arellano Felix family, and poured money into surveillance technology and bribery, reportedly buying off one of Mexico's top anti-drug generals, an arrangement so brazen that when the general was finally arrested in 1997, it humiliated the Mexican government in front of the world. And yet, where Escobar had been loud and political, Carrillo Fuentes was a ghost. One American newspaper described him as one of the most mysterious men in Mexico. A United States congressional briefing later called the scope of his network staggering, noting that he was forwarding $20 to $30 million to Colombia for each major operation and pulling in tens of millions every week. That obsession with staying hidden is what killed him. By 1997, the pressure was overwhelming. Agents had nearly grabbed him at his own sister's wedding, and he understood that his own face had become his greatest liability. So he decided to disappear in the most literal way possible by changing it. He wanted a new face and a new body, something that would let him walk through an airport unrecognized. On July 4, 1997, he checked into a Mexico City clinic under a false name and underwent hours of extensive plastic surgery and liposuction. He never came off the table alive. After roughly 8 hours, complications killed him. And no, I'm not making that up. The story did not even end with his death, because the men who performed that surgery met a darker fate still. Months later, the 2 surgeons who had operated on him were found dead, tortured, and sealed inside steel drums filled with concrete, discovered in November of 1997. The message was unmistakable. The DEA confirmed that the Lord of the Skies was gone, and when rumors spread that he had faked the whole thing to escape, the agency brushed them aside, saying the claim had about as much credibility as the millions of supposed sightings of Elvis Presley. The rumors were fed in part by comments from one of his own relatives, but the agency never wavered. A man who had spent his life making tons of cocaine vanish into thin air had in the end tried to make himself vanish too, and it cost him his life on a surgeon's table. Some of these men are dead, some are still locked away, and a handful are walking free at this very moment. The empires fell, but the trade they built never once slowed down. Thanks for watching. Click here for the next video.